Today on Co-op for Two, a survey of what might be called the mystery suspect cold case detective board game genre, and a review of 5 representative games from the genre. Just exactly what kind of games are these? Stay tuned to find out. So I am a big fan of these detective mystery type games. And I've just come to realize that there really are a couple different subgenres in here. And today we're going to be looking at what I'm now coming to think of as a very specific, narrow niche of this genre of figuring out crimes and stuff. And I'm calling these sort of mystery suspect games. This will be spoiler-free, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the general concept of these games, how they differ from some other detective board games, and then we'll go into, briefly, a little mini review of each of these 5 representative games, and I'll rank them which ones I think are worth your time. Okay, so what is this genre, mystery suspect games? I've done a lot of playthroughs and reviews of what I think of as the narrative detective mystery games. The classic game in that category is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. You're trying to solve a mystery. It can be any kind of mystery. And you're choosing what clues to look at. And there's a whole bunch of games in this genre. Sherlock Holmes has a spin-off. There's multiple boxes. There's 40 or 50 cases in the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective series. Then there are spin-offs using that same system, but in sort of horror, science fiction, Cthulhu world. That's Mythos Tales. There's some very old classic out-of-print games like Gumshoe, which I've done reviews and playthroughs of. And others, Ellery Queen. Those all have the same flavor. There's a big book with paragraphs. You choose where to go and you read a certain paragraph, etc. And there are some other games that I still lump into this same category, this same genre, like Detective Modern Crime board game and Chronicles of Crime. Those are both quite different, but they have this flavor of making actions of what clues you want to see next, and slowly unfolding a story, a mystery, unraveling it. Sometimes you don't know exactly what you're trying to solve, and at the end, you have to answer some questions. They all follow that same pattern. Now, there's a whole different class of games that on the surface you might want to lump into that same category. There's no randomness. They're all about deduction and figuring out a crime. But they've sort of proliferated lately. And here's 5 examples of them. You can see Amazon packed with these games, and there's a lot of them in the same series. This series, Unsolved Case Files, seems to be the largest collection of games. There's probably 10 different games in this series. Cold Case Files has a couple of them. Murder Mystery Party maybe rivals Unsolved Case Files for having a whole bunch of maybe 6 or 7 different cases. And then there's this other one that's created by a German company called IdVenture. There's like 4 games in this series, some of which, confusingly, were licensed by Murder Mystery Party. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so what do these games have in common? They are all focused on finding one suspect that did the crime, usually a murder, from a set of candidate suspects. So all of these games and all of the other games in this series, now there's dozens of them in these different series, are all basically you start out the game, You're dumped a huge collection of documents. There are no actions to take. And you've basically got a chart, whether it's explicit or implicit, where you've got your suspects. There's usually around 10 suspects or so, maybe 5 to 10. And each suspect might have a motive, an alibi, a means of committing the crime, usually a murder, etc. And at the end, when you're ready to solve it, you go onto a website. They all use a website. And you basically enter who you think is the real suspect who committed the crime. That's the basic formula of all of these games, of these 5 and then another 24 other games. Set of suspects, they all have kind of a motive, they all have kind of an alibi, and you're going through a huge amount of documents that you're dumped all at once to figure out who it is. When you're ready, you go on the website and solve it. There's no turns, there's no actions. Like in all the other games we talked about, Sherlock Holmes, you take an action to look at one little clue. There's no actions in these games. All of the information, for the most part, I'll talk about the exceptions, is given to you all at once. They're often framed as cold case files. If you're familiar with the concept of a cold case, it's when detectives can't solve some crime. After a certain number of years, it becomes a cold case. And then occasionally it'll get reopened and solved 20 years later by someone looking at all the case notes and the detective notes and re-interviewing people, etc. The focus on these games is also on realistic documents and giving you the immersive feel of being a detective. So I thought what we'd do is we'd just take a look at one of them so you can see basically what it looks like. This is representative of all of the games. And again, these games don't really have spoilers from looking at this document, because when you play the game, the first thing you'll do is open it up and look at all these documents. So if you want to look away while I show this off, you can. But again, this is the first thing you'd see if you open the box. So here's a good example. They all start with a little introduction, sort of narratively introducing you to the case, like, can you solve this case we haven't been able to solve? But notice it's all like trying to reproduce as if you're a real detective. They've all got like letterheads and documents. This is sort of traditional to list the components in the case. And then another common element for all these is like a little newspaper snippet. You'll see that in Sherlock Holmes too, but all of these games have little newspapers. And then some little props to make you feel like you're in a real world. There's a brochure. They all have some photographs. These are like crime scene photographs, photographs of documents, again, more props. It's frequent that you'll find some letters that were written between the suspects and the victim, whatever. Some lab reports, again, quite common. You're usually a police detective, so you've got lab reports, analysis of the stuff. And then what's also very common in these games is interviews or transcripts with the suspects. So here's a game where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 suspects that you're trying to figure out which one is the real suspect. And this is quite common. There's a lot to read here. And it's a transcript of interview, and most of your game will be spent, all of your game will be spent going through these documents, trying to find little clues, little inconsistencies in someone's alibi. That's a huge part of these games. Figure out what their motives are. Are they believable? Do they have a means to the crime? But tons of reading, lots of reading through transcripts and interviews. And that's the nature of these games. So it really is quite a specific subgenre. The experience when you play these games is also quite different. You don't feel like you're in a story for the most part that's ongoing. Some of these other games like Sherlock Holmes and Chronicles of Crime and Detective, you feel like you're going along real time while something is unfolding. And with those other games, it's rarely as simple as here are 5 suspects, figure out which one. That's a much more wide open genre where figuring out what's going on may be a big part of the case, and figuring out what happened, why it happened. These are all big parts. In this game, you're told right up front what happened, someone was killed, a crime was committed, and now you're trying to go through the evidence to figure out which of the identified suspects did it. So it's a different feel. You feel like you're a detective going through an old case file. And that's a unique feeling and a pretty great feeling if you like this idea of being a detective. As I said, they all use apps to solve the case in the end. And most of them don't use apps until you're ready to solve it or until you need a hint. Now, there are some exceptions. I'll talk about that a little bit. They differ a little bit, and this is where things get interesting, in exactly how they have you submit your final answer and how they help you with hints and what kind of information they want from you. In general, though, when you play Chronicles of Crime, Sherlock Holmes, which doesn't use an app, Chronicles of Crime that does, Vienna Connection, Detective Modern Crime. In those cases, you finish the case and you say, I'm ready to solve it. You click, I'm ready to solve it. Then you get questions. And then you get told, no, you were wrong, here was the right answer, and maybe a score. These cases aren't so harsh. In these cases, in general, what happens is when you're ready to solve it, you try to guess the answer. It's usually just one main answer, who did it. And if you get it wrong, the game says, nope, you're wrong, try again. And then you would go back and try to figure it out, what you did wrong. Or you'd get some hints, okay? So it's a slightly different endgame scenario. And then another big difference in these kinds of games, in these mystery suspect games, is how definitive the final evidence is. So I'll talk about when I review them. Some of them, when you finish it, when you find the stuff, you know exactly who did it and exactly why. Whereas other of these games take a much more approach that's much more sort of plausible. So you're trying to figure out, well, I don't have hard evidence that they did it, but here's the most likely person, and here's the inconsistency in their statement, which makes me suspect them. But you're never going to find hard and fast proof that they did it. So that's just a different choice in the designers and the writers how to do it. And which one you like is going to depend on your group, etc. Okay, so now I'm going to review these 5 briefly, but a good reminder is that I think it's fair to say that more than most cooperative board game genres, or tabletop games, your mileage on these mystery games will vary widely depending on your group, depending on whether you found the key stuff or not. If you just barely found the thing you needed to find and the game just hit that sweet spot for you or your group, you're going to feel good and smart for figuring it out. Whereas if you miss something, and just by happenstance, you could perseverate on one idea and miss a key clue, and you might have a bad experience. So it's going to depend on your tolerance for things and how lucky you get. So just remember, when I review these are my subjective opinions. We'll start with best and go to worst, in my opinion. Having played these and lots of others, to me it's very clear there's a qualitative separation into 2 classes in terms of quality for these games. This series, not Murder Mystery, but this German series, IdVenture, which is Fire in Adlerstein and Death in Antarctica, which was licensed by Murder Mystery Party. But here's another Murder Mystery Party that's not licensed. So I know that's confusing. But the IdVenture detective series, there's at least 4 really, that were converted into English. Adlerstein, Antarctica, Still Lake, and another brand new one called History something. Okay. These are the pinnacle of this genre. And they are, when you play these, you're getting a different experience from the rest of these Amazon.com sort of dozens of them being almost mass-produced. That's not to say they're not good. I'll talk about them. But Adlerstein was case 1, and the Antarctica one is case 2, and Still Lake is case 3. These are much more lengthy, epic experiences. They're much more carefully honed so that you'll have those aha moments, and the pacing of the game where you like figure out a little bit and then you start looking, digging deeper, and then you figure out a little more to connect those dots and connect those dots. There are some very satisfying moments in both of these games, and they try to do things a little differently. They both have some mid-game internet interaction. They tell you can get on the internet and look up facts, but they also have internet aspects of the game that you interact with specifically. I would say of these two, I preferred Death in Antarctica. It's got a very clever way. Most of these games, you're dumped everything at once, right? You're dumped all the documents, 40, 50 pages of documents or little props. And the best of these games figure out a way to sort of circumvent that idea that you're given everything all at once. So somewhere in the middle of the game, you'll get more information. Either you'll open more information or you'll get more information on the internet. And Antarctica does that particularly well. But both of these games give you those real pleasurable, deductive moments when you feel clever because you figured something out. And they all require you to really think hard and try to understand what's going on, why someone couldn't have been the suspect, why they have a good alibi. And they both also have some sort of crypto element, puzzly, logic puzzle type element. Whether your group is going to love that or hate it may depend, but that's something that the rest of these don't. The rest of these games are shorter and don't require that much time invested. These definitely are much lengthier, much more involved. So they're a completely different quality, a higher quality. They're also not... I talked about some of these games, when you figure it out, you know exactly all the answers to everything. And that may not be the case with these. With these, you may have a pretty good idea or a pretty strong suspicion, but you're going to have to make a little bit of a leap of faith. There's some interesting things that happen. You can get both of these games localized in English by the original German company. They come in these big black boxes. Or you can get the licensed version, Americanized version, which are a little, not simplified, but they have a totally separate help system, a totally separate solution website, and a little less props. But at least the German website, even the English localized German website, has a fantastic hint system. And when we played it live on the channel, when you think you really got it solved, we went through the hints slowly, and they're in a progression. And rather than guessing a solution and saying, give me the answer, we went through the hints to figure out how close we got to the solution. It's also the case that clearly a great deal of love and care went into the production of the documents and the props in these games. I won't show them to you, but they're full color, and they're a very wide variety of kinds of props and the kinds of documents. And it just makes for a very intriguing, interesting playthrough to get these different... It's not just photos and newspapers, but it's lots of other stuff. And they all feel really real, and a lot of care went into them. Okay. So that's the IdVenture detective series. They're all written by the same group of people. It's like there are 4 or 5 German authors that are involved in all these. All right, let's move on now. That's the top tier 1 of these games. Let's look now at my next favorite game, which was the Unsolved Case Files here. So the one I played here is Harmony Ashcroft, but there's a whole bunch of these. Now, all of the rest of these are much shorter experiences, much simpler. So this case was actually quite easy, certainly relatively easy and short, but surprisingly emotionally satisfying. And sometimes you play these games, there's a lot of writing, a lot of dialogue. There's these transcripts of interviews of people, and it's going to either feel real to you or feel staged and not. And the writing in this one, at least this specific case, I can't speak for all the Unsolved Case Files, but at least this specific case is quite good. The characters are well developed. They feel different. And they feel real. It feels like you're reading real interviews and transcripts. It's also an interesting case where you're not asked for you're not just given this and said, find the murder suspect. It's actually an interesting, different structure to this one. This one comes with envelopes. I believe it's like 4 different envelopes. We can open this up and look at it. Yeah. So there's three different envelopes. And the game basically asks you, you answer a question, then you open envelope A. So you've really got 4 different places. So they break the case down into 3 or 4 separate answers you have to come up with. And they're not asking you who did it at first. You're just trying to figure out one little piece of the mystery. And then you open this envelope to get some more information and give you the next challenge, the next question you have to answer. And that feels different. It's a different kind of experience. And it solves one of the things that can be lacking in these games, which is this idea that there's no development, there's no arc, there's no trajectory, because you're just given everything all at once. And there's not that much in those envelopes, and you go onto the website and you solve each question. But it feels different. And I don't want to spoil it, but there are like events that happen. It's a cold case, an old cold case, but the game makes you feel like there are actual events occurring as you're trying to solve it. And they're well done. They're well done. It's not like shocking and super, super satisfying, but it is well done and it feels real. There's another interesting thing that this game does that I really quite liked. There's a bunch of things in this game, even though it was a little easy and short, that I'd like designers to look at and learn from. So that was one of them. Another one was the way that it asks you for your solutions. So in most of these games, it says, you get to the end, you go on the website, and it says, who did it? Who's the suspect? And you take your best guess, right? And I said some of these games you have to guess, and you're just guessing plausible. This one is asking you different kinds of questions along the way, and it has a very definite answer it expects for each one. And there is a very explicit, definite answer for each of its stages of questions. But it doesn't just ask you, who did this? The way it does it on the website, it says, what 2 pieces of evidence give you the answer to this? So in the very end, it'll be like, who's the real suspect to blame? What 2 pieces of evidence give you that answer? And the choices, like in most of these kinds of games, you've just got your multiple choice. Like if there's 10 suspects in the game, you knew that when you open the document, and there they are. But this is different. It's asking you which 2 pieces of evidence. So for each of these 4 little questions, stages that you get asked, you're picking the 2 pieces of evidence from the complete list. Like I showed you the itinerary. When you open these cases, you get listed. Here's all the evidence in this box, in this bag. So this game just says, here's every piece of evidence. Now you identify the 2 that answer this question definitively and tell you who did it or where they did it or what their motive, whatever. So gone is the guessing. And all the rest of these games suffer from that. The rest of these games suffer from you getting to the end and being like, maybe this person, and maybe you're right, but you got it right for the wrong reason, or you missed the key evidence, but you still got it right, or you guessed and you guessed twice and get it right. You can't do that with this game. And it's very satisfying. It's like, who did it? And then what was the evidence that told you it was them? So again, this is on the side of those games that have a definitive, explicit, correct answer to each of these questions. And if you get it wrong, you've got a way to get hints. It's got a good hint system. And you know when you're trying to solve this that there are 2 pieces of evidence that will definitively answer that question. So very satisfying, slightly different experience. But part of the compromise from that is that it's a little easier because there are definitive evidence for each question. Okay, next on my list, that's the top 2. Top 1 would be Antarctica, top 2 would be Fire and Adlerstein, but those are the tier 1, and then tier 2 would be the Unsolved Case File. Then we get to tier 3, which I will list as this cold case game. It is a much, again, very short, maybe in the same category as this one, maybe even shorter, but much more straightforward. Sort of a thinner story, not as rich a mystery, not as confusing a mystery, much more focused, less distractions. Easier. And Marco Wargamer channel, Marco OmniGamer, one of my favorite board game reviewers, and he's got lots of experience with this genre and almost all the others, has an interesting review of this. But one of the interesting things is in his review, like I generally agreed with his review. He's like, meh, it's just mediocre, and I would agree with all that. But then he said, they went through it very quickly. They knew the answer, but then they got asked some bonus questions that they didn't really know. But then when they read the answer, it made sense. They went back. And I would say, maybe that's not being as fair to the game as you could be, because this game does have a bunch of bonus questions that all have clear answers that are somewhat harder to, like, you have to understand the case more and you have to sort of pay a little more attention and not overlook stuff. So I do think that if you put the time into this, you might get some more satisfaction than you would think by trying to get those bonus, by trying to understand the case, really the subtle parts of the case deeply. Maybe pause when you read the questions, and if you don't know the answer to even the bonus questions, don't just say, give me the answer. But try to understand all the aspects. But this would be a very good starter game. If you're like a family beginner player and you're not sure if this genre is for you, this would be a very reasonable one to start with. And I would say maybe I should back up a little bit and talk about one of the other ways that these games differ is sort of how well the solution is presented to you, how fully fleshed out a story and satisfying it is. The IdVenture series, the Adlerstein and Antarctica, have big, long descriptions that walk you through with photos all of how you should have put together the evidence and understood everything and fill in the missing pieces that you didn't know. I believe Harmony Ashcroft does the same thing, the Unsolved Case Files, in addition to giving you some emotional flavor. I think this one was sort of mid-range there. Not as satisfying an ending, but reasonably good. Okay, now let's move to the last one down on my list. The lowest rating game is this murder mystery party, Underwood Cellars. Now, and before I talk about this, I want to remind you how confusing this is, that the best game, the highest ranked game on my list, is also licensed under this Murder Mystery Party series. But I think I'm fairly confident in saying that they did not write this one in-house. This is written by the German company and released separately and then transported and licensed to them. These are sort of the mass-manufactured games on Amazon, and so it's a totally different caliber of experience, even though on the face of it, the structure looks similar. I do think there's an interesting structure in this particular game that's kind of addresses that issue of not dumping everything at once on you. It's kind of broken up into two parts. That's kind of cool and clever. And the writing, in terms of the dialogue, there's lots of interviews and stuff. The writing is believable and good. However, there's very little to figure out. But most damning, the motives, the storyline, the plot, the answer, all feels unsatisfying, incomplete, implausible. So it is a disappointing mystery to be trying to solve. I don't think you're going to be thrilled with yourself when you solve it, even when you get it right. It's one of these things where the evidence is, you'll either classify it as one thing was obvious and gave you the solution, but the rest of the mystery didn't make sense, or it's all going to feel quite implausible to you. And unfinished. It kind of feels unfinished. The solution is just like a paragraph or two. It feels completely unfinished. And, you want a reward when you finish these things. You want to read the story of what happened and sort of be like, oh, that fills in that. That's so cool. And yes, I got that. I figured that out. There's none of that here. It's just like a throwaway. The question at the end just asks you to pick who the culprit is, and that's all you do. You click on their name, and you get said, yes, you got it all if you guessed their name, no if you didn't. If you need a hint, it's not a very well designed hint system. You're likely to not know what hints you should. There's a bunch of hints, right? But whereas in some of these games, from reading that, it's like a spoiler tag. You're like, well, if you didn't understand this, here are the 3 hints in sequence you should look at to gradually fill you in. This one's like, I don't know what clicking this is going to tell me, and maybe it's going to tell you a big chunk that you didn't want it to tell you. You just wanted a little hint. So it's a very coarse set of hints. They're not very useful. And again, I don't think you're going to be satisfied when you get to the end of this case. Okay, so that's the 5 games in this genre, mystery suspect genre. I told you which ones I enjoyed the most. I did love these 2 IdVenture games, and I really liked some of the little mechanics in the Unsolved Case Files one. I'm looking forward to trying some more of these to see if they're all as good. I would definitely recommend it on the beginner scale, and maybe I might even recommend to try this as your first case if you're not sure if these are going to be too difficult for you. Let's sum up. I do think that this is rightfully classified as a different kind of genre. Suspect, alibi, motive, you cross people off. This person had an alibi, couldn't have done it, I get rid of them. When you get rid of all the possibilities, you've got your one suspect. That's very different from the wide open mystery category of some of these other games like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detectives and Chronicles of Crime, which can feel like a story that's unveiling itself that you have no idea what direction it's going into. Who's going to like these kinds of games? Some people are going to love the document dump of these games. The feeling like that you've got your hands on now this big, thick, cold case file that you can just pour yourself into. I happen to love that. There's something exciting about having a rich collection of documents that you have to master. Tons of reading. All of these games, all of the mystery games, Sherlock Holmes, have lots of reading, but the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, you're reading a little paragraph at a time, and building this Very cool, unfolding experience. This is much more of a throwing yourself into the deep end, looking for a needle in a haystack. Some people are going to love that. There's no actions to take. You're not deciding where to go and what to do. And so some people are going to miss that sort of gamey aspect of making agonizing decisions. Which of these two pieces of evidence do I have time to look at? Or just feeling like you've got some agency in deciding where to go and what to look at. And that's a real decision that you're thinking about. Here, there's none of that. You're just going through your documents. I do think that that difference in style is going to be more important depending on the size of your group. The nature of these games, giving you all these documents that you can then go through, is very well suited to have a bunch of people sitting around independently going off in different directions studying documents. If you had 4 people, you could easily say, each of you read the transcripts of the interviews of a different suspect and tell us what you notice. Or one person might want to be studying these little details, crime scene photos, and another person might be looking at fingerprints. So I think these games might be better suited for a larger player group in a way that some of the traditional narrative mystery games like Sherlock Holmes aren't. You don't all have to be focusing on the same thing. And it's quite likely that one person can be like, well, I don't think we fully understood this. Let me really dig into this and try to understand it. So I think for a larger group, there's some real value in these games. I do think also with these games, none of these games you see here destroy any component. They all have a little sheet for you to keep notes about suspects and alibis, but I think the solution there is just to not use those sheets. But assuming you don't use those sheets, and there's some envelopes that are sealed and you can open up, but that doesn't affect the game at all. So all of these games you're only going to play once, but you can pass on, and I think that's important. Some of them are quite short, 1 or 2 hours. None of them, if you play by yourself, are probably going to take you more than 3 or 4 hours, depending on how you play it. Although when I play it live on stream and read everything aloud, they get into the 6-hour territory. So you're going to get a 2-hour experience, 2 to 6 hour, or 1 to 6 hour experience. Okay. So I do think, unlike some games, price is going to be an issue here. If you treat these like a night out or a night at the movies, I think that's probably a good way to think about it. Some of these games come up on sale quite often. And I think, I tend to not sort of give advice on prices. What you're comfortable with is going to depend on you. But as an example, if these games fluctuate, like Adlerstein, one of my favorites, is on sale at Amazon now for like $17. I mean, that's a no-brainer for me. That's $17 worth of entertainment if you get 5 hours of it. Some of these games fluctuate, and they go up to like $25, $30. And I do think that's probably too much to pay for the simpler ones. But you can watch these, and when you find one whose price drops under $20, I think that's when it starts getting to be appealing for what it is, even if it's not a hugely compelling case. It's a nice way to spend a couple hours and test your brain and learn a little bit about figuring out how to solve mysteries. So I think I would advise in general to maybe watch for when these drop in price and go on sale. And if you're serious and you want a harder, more robust experience, you cannot go wrong with the IdVenture Detective Stories series. Fire in Adlerstein, Death in Antarctica, Still Lake, etc. So there you have it. Let me know which of these games you enjoyed the most. You can watch some playthroughs on our channel, and I'll be playing through some more of these. There are a couple other series, and again, I do want to try some more in the Unsolved Case Files series and see if they're all as good. I'll be playing Still Lake, the hardest of the IdVenture games, on the channel in probably next week. Thanks for sticking with this long video. I'll see you next time.